The parts of the psyche and their functioning. The human psyche is not a chaotic mixture of emotions, thoughts, and impulses, as it is often portrayed. It is a living structure, composed of precise psychological parts, each with its own function, logic, and goal. Every person, from the very first moment of their existence, carries this inner architecture. At its center lies the ego, the core of subjective consciousness, the I, whose task is to coordinate the inner life. But the ego, in the beginning, is weak. It exists, not as a formed ruler of the psyche, but as a fragile flame that must learn to manage the forces surging within. Surrounding the ego are the other parts, the emotional part that feels, the mental part that thinks, the relational part that connects and seeks love, the active part that acts and defends, and the sensory part that strives for survival and pleasure. Each of these parts has its own impulses, its own goals, and none of them naturally cares about the well-being of the personality as a whole. They operate according to their own inner drive, without coordination, without reflection. When the ego is weak, the personality is like a stage where different actors, each driven by their own desires, compete for dominance. Emotions, thoughts, the urge to act, the need for love and comfort swirl in a chaotic storm, and the person lacks direction, lacks stability, lacks integrity. The first major step in the development of consciousness is for the ego to begin to bring the other psychological parts under its control. This does not mean their suppression or destruction, but the recognition of their demands, the assessment of their appropriateness, and the making of a conscious decision whether to indulge or regulate their energy. In this phase, the personality learns to act not based on every fleeting emotion or desire, but according to consciously chosen criteria that protect the integrity of the whole. While in the first and second phases of consciousness development, the goal is control over the psychological parts, in the third and fourth phases, a deeper process begins. Integration. Integration is no longer a struggle between the ego and the other parts, but a conscious unification. The psychological parts, under the influence of the mature ego, begin to see their function clearly and willingly place themselves in service of the whole. They no longer assert themselves with irrational needs, but cooperate, aligned with the values and goals set by the mature ego, or, at a higher level, by the soul itself. Thus, the personality becomes not only controlled, but also internally harmonized. Its thoughts, feelings, desires, and actions are no longer in conflict, but flow together like different streams converging into the same ocean. And then, the person ceases to be a battlefield of inner conflicts and becomes a whole, conscious being. Understanding the psychological parts and their nature is a fundamental step toward true self-awareness. Only when we consciously recognize their influence, when we establish the control we owe to ourselves, and when we allow their energy to serve higher goals, can we speak of true development of consciousness. That is the path to psychological maturity. That is the path to becoming a person, in the truest sense of the word. The psyche is not diagnosed, it is cultivated. In tech, theory of evolution of consciousness, a person is never viewed as broken or sick. Every individual, regardless of their emotions, inner conflicts, or insecurities, is seen as a psyche in development, something that is still growing, still forming, still searching. Just as you wouldn't blame a child for not knowing how to read, but instead give them time and guidance to learn, tech sees emotional instability, a fluctuating personality, the need for external approval, or even hysterical outbursts, not as psychological disorders, but as natural stages in the developmental path that every human being goes through. We feed the child, raise it, care for it, until it becomes capable of caring for itself. The same applies to the psyche, until the ego becomes a mature, stable center that coordinates the inner psychological parts. The personality is not yet finished. but it is not sick, either. Modern psychology often rushes to label any deviation as a disorder, forgetting that what it sees may simply be a different phase of development, not a defect. Tech makes a clear distinction. If consciousness still searching, still doesn't have control over the emotions, the body, or thoughts, that is not illness, it is growth. Even in cases of psychopathy or narcissism, we are not speaking of illness, because the person is not suffering. Others suffer because of their behavior, but the individual does not. In such cases, we are looking at a stagnation in the development of consciousness. Instead of striving toward integration and self-growth, the ego has identified with just one part of the psyche. This is developmental stagnation. You can learn more on this topic in the playlist. Theory of Evolution of Consciousness, Tech. Tech does not view the human being as an object to be fixed. It sees them as a psychological organism that needs the right conditions to grow. And here lies the difference. Psychology gives a diagnosis. TC gives understanding. Psychology is already working with the parts of the psyche, it just doesn't recognize them as such. A clear example is the technique of role-playing. Modern psychology lacks a clear map of the psyche. It speaks of emotions, thoughts, behaviors, as if these are disconnected phenomena. But paradoxically, many therapeutic techniques intuitively reveal something much deeper: that a person is a structure composed of multiple inner voices, psychological parts, each with its own logic, energy, and needs. For example, the role-playing technique used in Gestalt therapy, transactional analysis, family systems therapy, and even in some cognitive behavioral approaches does exactly that. It activates the energy of a particular psychological part. The therapist might say, "Talk to your inner child." This clearly addresses the emotional part of the psyche. Or, "Tell that critic in your head everything you need to." This is addressing the mental part. Or, "What would your anger do if we let it speak?" This speaks to the active part of the psyche. In tech language, this means, let's call forth the emotional part. Let's give space to the mental part. Let's become aware of the active part. They may not use these terms, but that is exactly what they're doing. Ironically, many therapists don't believe that the psyche has internal structured parts, yet they work with them every day. They simply don't have a name for what they're witnessing. Even more interestingly, when a therapist encourages this internal dialogue, when they guide the person to recognize a voice, to separate from it, to stop identifying with it, they are, intuitively, training the most important psychological function: the ego. Yes, this is the work of the ego. Not to control, not to repress, but to observe, distinguish, and decide. This is not me. This is the mental part repeating a voice from the past. This is not the truth. This is an emotional part that needs protection. What does TC do? Tech introduces nothing new to the inner human experience. It simply names what has always existed, and what psychologists already use, but do not fully understand. That's why tech is a tool that can complement psychology, not with diagnoses, but with structure, not with labels, but with an understanding of the mechanisms behind every inner movement. And when a client learns to distinguish those voices, they are, in fact, activating and strengthening the function of the ego. The actor is not a pretender, but a master of the psyche. We often say the best actors are talented, that they know how to get under someone's skin, to transform. But we rarely ask, what is actually happening inside their psyche when they do that? From Tech's perspective, the answer is clear. The actor is not pretending. They have developed the ability to recognize, summon, and express a specific psychological part, and give it full space to manifest, while the ego remains consciously present and in control. This means that a great actor does not simulate emotion. They let the emotional part speak. They don't fake aggression. They let the active part, the macho man, come onto the stage. They don't play the femme fatale. They channel the relational part, femme fatale, to the maximum. And all of this, they do without getting stuck in the role. The actor is not multiple personalities. They are multi-whole. All of us have different psychological parts, but in most people they act spontaneously, without control from the ego or conscious awareness. In a good actor, these parts are recognized, mastered, and put in service of artistic expression. That's why actors often have a better understanding of the human psyche than many psychologists, because they know it from the inside. They know its voices. They feel the difference between, I am this part, and I am the one playing this part. An actor is not a liar. An actor is a master of psychological energy. They show us what we could all be if we got to know all of our inner parts and stopped being afraid of them. And that's why, instead of asking, what's wrong with me, maybe it's time to ask, which part of me is speaking right now? And am I, as the conscious center, going to let that part lead, or will I pause and choose differently? The psyche is not something that needs to be fixed. It's something that needs to be understood. And only when we understand it, can we truly guide it. If some of the terms you heard aren't fully clear, check out the playlist, Theory of Evolution of Consciousness, Tech. There, step by step, all phases, parts, and the full process of building the personality and awakening consciousness are explained. Until then, observe. Not to judge yourself, but to recognize yourself. If you recognize something true in this video, share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe your insight will help someone else find themselves. And if you'd like to keep walking this path together, click subscribe, because this is just the beginning. You're on the path. And that's all that matters.